Good morning and welcome to the Point. The state legislature has taken a couple of weeks off, though there are some big plans ahead for Michigan roads. We'll talk about that at the end of this show. But first, a continuation of a conversation about a major issue in Michigan, and that's sexual assault on college campuses. We talked with a Republican senator a few weeks ago. This morning, Democratic Senator Rebekah Warren and her take on a big summit that was recently held in Lansing. Senator, I want to start with something that when I first heard about it, it made me take a step back. On one hand, we know that historically, college has been a place where young men and some young women can find themselves in situations that they haven't encountered before. But you were recently part of a summit along with Republican lawmakers, the First Lady, and others, that's dealing with the idea and how to combat, how to address, how to make people aware of sexual assault on college campuses. You have two big state universities in the district that you serve, but even beyond that, right. Obviously, that is a concern. Tell me a little bit about that summit, how it came about, and what you think came out of it.
So I'll tell you my path to involvement. So about 6 months ago, the White House task force released a report on campus sexual assault throughout the country. And it highlighted some places where some of our campuses are doing a great job of investigating concerns and handling perpetrators and survivors, and places where, frankly, some of our campuses aren't doing very well. And 3 of Michigan's campuses were cited in that report as needing to do some work and are actually now under Title IX investigation for how they've been handling things. The University of Michigan, and the district I represent, Michigan State University, and Grand Valley. And so it kind of popped up on my radar as something that we need to be doing a better job about. I started working on some legislation and a resolution to encourage some collaboration between local communities and campuses, our law enforcement, survivor advocacy groups, the Greek system, really to get everybody at the table. And at that time, the First Lady, who really has not lent her name to a lot of issues, which makes me feel like this is something she's incredibly passionate about, because she doesn't lightly lend her name and her time and talent to issues of public policy, started to form this idea of having a one-day summit as a launch to a campaign to do something better. And she invited me and my Republican counterpart in the Senate, Tanya Shoemaker, and then 2 House members, Democratic Representative Marilyn Lane, Republican Representative Laura Cox. It was very bicameral, bipartisan, and we really pulled together folks from around the state to say, what can we do better, and how can we really address this pretty awful statistic, which is that about 1 in 5 of our young people will be a victim of sexual assault during their campus years. We've got to do better.
When you consider that statistic and consider the number of young people in our rich university system in the state, how do you go about, what did you hear from the summit? What is your own personal experience in dealing with your campuses? What is the way that you communicate to these folks who at once you would say, well, wait a minute, you must inherently understand that this is wrong, yet we know it happens. Mm-hmm. So how do you communicate that both to the students, and I assume to the faculty, and to the administration, and to the parents?
Well, I think the bottom line is, I think we know a few things that that can be factors that can lead to situations where bad things happen, right? We know that the use of drugs and alcohol can really have an impact on how situations develop. We know things like lighting and making sure it's safe routes when people are coming home and it's after dark. And in Michigan in the fall, it can be dark at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. You don't have to be on the street at 1 o'clock in the morning for it to be dark. So what we wanted to do is look at those best practices. There's some of our campuses, like I said, who really are getting it right, who have safe ride systems to make sure that folks can get home safely if they've been drinking or if it's just dark and they don't want to walk home alone. That we know that we have now technology advancing so much that we have apps and things that bystanders can use if they want to report that they've seen something but feel a little nervous about getting in the middle of something, either for their own safety to stay out of a situation that's escalating. And really to take all of these things that we know, how we can make it as safe as possible, how we can make sure that we're doing everything we can to prosecute perpetrators, to say this is a serious crime, and if it happens, whether it's on campus or off campus, you're going to be punished to the full extent of the law, and to say to survivors, you're going to be supported on campus and through your process, and really have that discussion about how to take best practices and put them into place so every campus is as safe as it can be around this whole state.
This was a big one-day summit. I understand it's really the first of its kind, perhaps, in the nation, which I find somewhat surprising, but also somewhat gratifying that's happening here in Michigan. So you identified some of these issues, the best practices perhaps being the most important, simply to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page. As a form of implementation, is this you and the rest of your group working with all of these interested parties, or is this something that becomes more formal in legislation as you discussed?
I think it will be both. Honestly, we do have some pieces of legislation that have been introduced, but one of the things we were able to announce at the summit, and you're right, it was, we're told, one of the first in the nation of this type and size. And the response was overwhelming. We had way more folks than we ever expected. We pushed the boundaries of what the fire marshal would let us have in the room that we had reserved for this one-day space, which is wonderful because, again, it was administrators, students, campus and community public safety officers, it was survivor advocates, it was domestic violence advocates, it was the Greek system. It really was everybody who needed to be there was there in that day, and that was really wonderful. But one of the things we were able to announce at that summit was that in the budget that has just recently been signed, we were able to get $500,000, so $500,000 of funding for these kinds of best practices, for grants to our higher education institutions who are seeking to to make things better and safer on campus. And so maybe they need new lights, maybe they need some of this new technology, maybe they frankly need some of these, one of the things we heard about was how important it is that when victims first come forward and are being sort of telling their story and their stories being investigated, how important it is that we understand what they're going through still physically and emotionally so that the investigations go well. Some of our public safety officers need that training to be a little more sensitive and understanding about what people are going through immediately post attack of that nature. So there'll be this competitive process where we'll have $500,000 that will be able to be distributed to try to make this work on our campuses.
Well, and I try to underline the significance of that because when you look at the budget process as it is, and we may later in this program talk about some of the constraints when it comes to roads, but when you look at the budget process as it is, there is no wiggle room for dollars and cents. So $500,000 out of a $54 billion budget might not sound like a lot of money, but for a program that's really just coming into fruition, you just had this summit and this money was already included in the budget, means a significant recognition of the problem by you and your colleagues and the folks involved in the budget process, which seems to me to be quite a step.
Well, it is, and in fact, in the Senate, when the budget was first moving, this budget that it's housed in right now is actually the state police budget, and our state police director is going to help, help us implement this grant program. But it was first left out of the Senate budget. They actually took it out in committee, and the governor had recommended it. They took it out, and some folks have said, well, does this mean your colleagues in the Senate don't think this is important or didn't value this? But no, I think you've hit it right on the head, Rick. It's that the money is so tight that any new program, it's a Herculean effort to get any new program funded, and especially at that level, at $500,000. And it did take a little bit of work with our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to say, no, this is really something important, and this is, it can be a game-changing thing on these campuses. And we were able at the, really only at the floor level, at sort of the 11th hour, to get the Senate to put it back in. So it is not because it was an important issue, but because the budget is tight and a new program getting funded just doesn't happen every day here right now.
No, it doesn't. And the one other thing before we leave this subject that I want to go back to the conversation I had with Senator Shoemaker, one of the things that she identified, I think you all identified, is that all of these things that you want to do can be helpful, but this really needs to start with a conversation with parents and students before they go, and have the conversation with your male students and female students before they go to college, right?
Absolutely, and the parent involvement, making sure that that people know where to go if something feels scary or feels unsafe, knowing that they can call for help without fear, even if they have been maybe drinking or doing something like that makes them a little more vulnerable. We've got to work together as a whole community, and it can't just be those on campus. It's those of us who live in campus communities. It's our public safety officers, even off campus, because our off-campus housing is just as scary and dangerous sometimes as the on-campus dorms or community areas.
We're back with more with Senator Warren next. To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. If you are a Democrat and serving in the state legislature in Lansing, you are in the minority, whether it's in the House or in the Senate. Senator Rebekah Warren, an Ann Arbor Democrat, says that even though she's in the minority, she's able to get things done. And she says, even though she considers herself one of the most liberal members of the legislature. You very often refer to yourself and are referred to by some groups who recognize these things as the most liberal member of the state legislature. Is that the way you feel?
It's been voted by independent sources 8 years running that I'm the most liberal member of the chamber I've served in, so several times in the House, and now that I'm in the Senate, yeah, they just keep saying that.
I bring that up partially because it's a running conversation of ours, but I'm looking around your office. Mm-hmm. And I look at legislation to protect the Great Lakes. I look at legislation that recognizes autism. I look at legislation that deals with any number of things. And in almost every one of those cases, it's a bipartisan effort with a Republican senator from Saugatuck, with a Republican lieutenant governor in 2 cases. How does it come at a time when people think that government in general, perhaps Washington much more so than Lansing, is so polarized and so dysfunctional, and you happily accept the title of the most liberal member in the legislature, yet many of your efforts are bipartisan?
Well, I have always served in a divided legislature, so anything I've been able to accomplish had to be done in a bipartisan manner, certainly. And I've actually had colleagues ask me before, that just flat out ask me, so you're the most liberal member, and often people who are at the polls, the extremes, whether you're conservative or liberal, tend to be not productive, frankly, tend to be folks who are not able to work with other people. And I think the thing that has, and asks flat out, how can this be, Rebekah? How can you get all this work done, all this great work done, and still be so liberal? And I think it's, it's partly it's relationships, making sure to build relationships with people that share interests, that I am 100% uncompromising on my core values, and so it's not even a question that I would compromise the things that are so central to me in my district, but on all those areas where we have such need to come together on healthcare and mental health, on protecting our Great Lakes natural resources, on so many other issues. There's so much work that can be done in a bipartisan way, and I'm very, very careful to be respectful of the process and the people I work in. There's no one's ever quoted me anywhere saying, calling out by name somebody and saying they're a horrible person or their ideas are horrible, because you want to work with people, and there's plenty that we can work on together. There's much more that brings us together as Michiganders than divides us as Democrats and Republicans, as liberals and conservatives. And I keep trying to find that space because, frankly, I think that's the job. I think that's what people sent me to Lansing to do, is to get something done for the people of Michigan every day, every week, every month. And that's what I try to do. I take it seriously.
For as long as I've covered politics, I've heard people use a kind of tired phrase, but it seems in this case it may be applicable that you are able to disagree without being disagreeable.
Well, it's true. It's true. And I think, at the end of the day, I want to accomplish things that matter for our people. And sometimes that means I have to put blinders on to some of the things my colleagues do or say that I don't always love, or the other efforts that they are trying to move forward that I disagree with. But every day, every hour up here, there's the chance to work together on something else. And that's the legacy that I want. And to be able to say many of those years, while I am elected by these groups that do these polls to say that I'm the most liberal member, I've also had the most bills signed into law of any member of the minority in either chamber. And so that is, I find a way to work with people.
Let's talk about some of the things that are going on now that have an impact on our state coming from the federal government. The Supreme Court has delivered a third that I can think of right off the top of my head that deals with energy. We may not get to that, but 2 major rulings that dealt with Michigan Central issues. Let's start first with same-sex marriage. One of the cases was from, I believe, probably from your area.
Close to me, yep.
Very close to.
Yep.
And the question was about same-sex marriage, which the justices came out in a very broad fashion and said would be accepted around the country, including in Michigan.
Right.
So my question to you is, given that that's what the Supreme Court said, and that just weeks before, the legislature passed bills that suggested that those adoption agencies with deeply held religious views did not have to necessarily perform adoption services for same-sex couples. Is that ruling and that bill, or those bills, are those on a collision course with each other?
I think they should be, frankly, and I know there are going to be colleagues that see a need to sort of stake out some space for religious tolerance, for religious freedom, for whatever words they would use. But I've always thought that while we have a healthy, long established separation of church and state, while we have built into our Constitution this desire and sort of mandate that we protect individual religious liberty, and that's very central to who we are as Americans, it's a really different conversation when you're talking about state dollars. And what we're talking about here with those adoption agencies is they're taking tens of millions of dollars of state money, of our taxpayer money, and then deciding that they're going to work with some Michiganders and not with others. And to me, I don't care if that's based on race or marital status or sexual orientation or income, ability to pay. That should be wrong, because state dollars should be used for state programs in an equal way without discrimination. And just cloaking yourself in whether it's a moral objection, a religious objection, whatever, is not a reason that you should be able to discriminate with state dollars ever.
Is that something that ends up in the courts, in your opinion?
It'll be interesting to see. I think there are folks who are looking at it right now. I think there are folks who are kind of worried about what comes next. That was sort of a narrow piece of legislation that really only dealt with our child placing agencies, foster cares and adoption agencies. There are others who have even, colleagues of mine who've said, we've got bills that go way farther than that protect folks who do business in the state and provide public accommodation in the state, and maybe we want to give them a similar kind of protection, and that might actually move maybe even quickly. I think those are the kind of places that you're going to see this real debate heat up to say, who are we as Michiganders? And one of the things that's the most troubling, I think, for me and a lot of the folks that I represent and serve with, is now we have a federal law. Now we have a federal ruling that has the force of law that says same-sex marriage is legal in Michigan. So you could, if you were a person who had a same-sex partner, you could get married today. And if you put that on your Facebook page or you announced it to the public, you could be fired from your job tomorrow. There is still no civil rights protection in Michigan for sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. So you can be fired from your job. You can be denied housing, accommodations in public. You can, all of that is still legal under Michigan law. And that's where I think the collision course really is that we are going to have to take steps to address this inequity that still exists even if marriage is now legal.
And that brings up the interesting question that Governor Snyder has repeatedly called for the expansion of the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act that's here in the state to include the LGBT community. Mm-hmm. The legislature, under its current configuration, has not made it a priority. Right. It has been suggested to me by some of their leadership that it is not a priority. So given that, how do you move that forward if leadership isn't on board to get it started?
Well, we today, even so, that's my piece of legislation in the Senate to expand Elliott Larson to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. I had asked the committee chair, which is Senate Majority Leader Meekoff, to have a hearing on that bill a few months ago when it was first introduced or reintroduced this session. We have decided as a whole caucus today that we are going to reiterate that request as a caucus, because now that we have the marriage decision, and that is the law of the land in Michigan, it seems very out of sync to have a civil rights protection that does not extend to this community, and setting up really that conflict that I just described. You could get married and then get fired. You get married and then get kicked out of your apartment. I mean, just real serious concerns about the way that now Michigan law operates. So we're going to ask for it, and we're going to see if minds have changed at all by what's happening. The decision by the court, what we've seen in other states when they have taken action to either provide that protection or to limit that protection in some way. Our friends in Indiana got kind of a tough reaction when they tried to put some limitations on some of those civil rights and liberties. So we're hoping that people's minds are changing. People are seeing these issues very differently than they ever did before, and hopefully our elected leadership will get there too.
Another big ruling by the Supreme Court deals with the Affordable Care Act. And the ruling, while it did have an impact in Michigan, the real impact, had that ruling gone the other way, many believe, would be to send that insurance program into a death spiral. Because if the exchanges, like the ones in Michigan, were not eligible to receive the subsidies, prices go up, people get out of the system gets overloaded because it doesn't have enough money to go around, and it goes into this. So from your perspective, on a very controversial piece of legislation that remains after 6 years a controversial piece of legislation, what was the impact of that ruling for Michigan?
I think it was really important for Michigan, you know, and I had the chance, I was the Democratic Vice Chair of the Health Policy Committee when we took up the issue of having a state-based exchange. We had the votes to pass that in the Senate. We did pass that in the Senate, and unfortunately our colleagues in the House did not meet us halfway on that policy at that time, which led us to the place that we are now in terms of not having a state-based exchange. But there is no question, and I know folks have lots of big feelings about the policy one way or the other, but there's no question, you look at the numbers, Michigan is so much better off for having had this partnership with the federal government under the Affordable Care Act. We have so many folks now who have coverage, who've never had coverage before or have been underinsured before. We have so many folks who are getting primary care visits, and every single week still, we hear stories, not just from our own districts, but from our colleagues' districts, of people who are saying, I'm getting my prescription drugs for the first time regularly, and I don't have to choose between paying my rent and getting my prescriptions. Or folks who get a primary care visit, because that's one of the positives of this, is you got to get in quickly and see a primary care provider. Somebody discovered they had cancer and they were able to get into treatment, and really meant the difference between life and death and quality of life. And so it's been a wonderful thing, I think, for a lot of Michiganders, and so I'm very happy with that decision. I think it really means good things can continue in Michigan.
One of the companions of that in the state of Michigan is the Medicaid expansion, the Healthy Michigan. And in looking at that program moving forward, there are already more people that are taking advantage of it, I think, than was predicted. On one hand, as you point out, there's a very good upside to that because you have people that have health insurance. On the other side, there's also a cost factor. Are you concerned about the state's increasing liability or exposure to those costs going forward, given the financial constraints that we talked about earlier?
Well, first of all, you know, this was always meant to be a partnership with the federal government, and it's front-loaded, so the first few years are more heavily paid for from Washington, and rather than from our coffers here in Lansing. The way that our program was set up in Michigan, we're kind of collecting some of these savings that are happening and tucking them away for the future. So I think we've been fiscally smart and sound about planning for the eventual increase in Michigan's share of covering these folks. But you know, really, there's this idea that I firmly believe is true, that we are able to, by having more folks in systems where they have access to primary and preventative care, we're able to start to reduce some of the pressures on our budget, Medicaid budget, for these chronic diseases and conditions that are so expensive. If we can get folks in treatment early, if we can identify, like I said, identify a cancer, identify a predisposition for diabetes or hypertension, or some of these things that end up being lifelong expensive things for our Medicaid pocketbook, we can really drive down some of the costs, and we can help people make smart choices about diet and exercise. And there are a lot of incentives in there that hopefully mean 10 years from now we have a healthier Michigan population. And that's why it's called Healthy Michigan, right? We want a healthier Michigan population, and hopefully those costs are going down even if the number of people being insured is going up.
We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. This week in the legislature, we expect the House to come back into session and perhaps consider what's going to happen with that Senate roads plan. As you know, the House has their own version of a bill that would help pay for road repair in the state. The Senate recently passed their own version. They differ considerably. So the House could take up the Senate plan, or they could start negotiating. Either way, it's the one real big piece of legislation that lawmakers have to deal with this summer. If, and that's a big if, they can come up with a resolution, they'll probably take most of the rest of the summer off. Either way, we'll be here to talk about it again next Sunday. To the Point.